Okay, so part two of the podcast, we left off on the slide group behavior, talking about group think. So again, just stating that group think happens when people in a group really desire to function together cohesively, and so all the members of the group want things to run smoothly, and so they may gloss over potential problems, ignore sort of red flags in making a decision, or ignore other people's opinions that don't match that of the group as a whole. And so, really, maintaining harmony becomes more important than addressing potential red flags. And so, that can be definitely a problem. And in a lot of groups, you're in the group for a reason. If you remember, we choose to interact with a lot of people in groups that we're in because we share like ideas and preferences and prejudices. And so a couple slides back, I had mentioned that, we tend to filter out opposing viewpoints when it doesn't match that to which the group that we're in. And that could be really harmful to open dialogue, which is important, and exposure of new ideas. And today we live in a world that's so dominated by Facebook, social media, the internet. And every day we see new websites sprouting up. And what they do is they draw on our social lives, right? So, an increasing number of our interactions being online are starting to filter what we see and what we're exposed to in ways that cater to things we click on, or things we watch, or things that we scroll past. And so this can really filter sort of the color of the world that we're seeing. And so the question that I often think about is, what are the effects of this on us without us even really being aware? Um, are we kind of living in sort of a world where everything echoes reinforcement of what we already believe, rather than presenting us with other alternatives or things that we hadn't considered? In other words, interacting with a more um, diverse mix of friends, and that can often, when we have diversity across friendship circles and whatnot, we open ourselves up to different thoughts and opinions. Whereas when we insulate ourselves with only those who share our viewpoints, that can become, um, you know, sort of a limiting factor, maybe even make us ignorant. There was an interesting study that I'm thinking of that I just saw not too long ago that looked at similarly aligned political attitudes among people on Facebook. So, you have your friends on Facebook on different groups and stuff you might be a part of. And usually, we align ourselves with those who are politically similar to ourselves. Unsurprisingly, they found that friends tended to agree more with each other than at random. However, they also looked at the perceptions of individuals on how similar their friends were. And here they discovered that people are actually fairly poor estimators um, of how similar they are to their friends, generally thinking that they're more similar than they actually are. So it really, the results of the study showed that while we might be similar to our friends, we often don't actually know our friends' opinions all that well, especially in today's day and age where people present themselves in a certain view. On social media, we talked about self presentation, right? And making first impressions. People will often present certain sides of themselves wanting to look a certain way, and they may actually hide their real feelings or their true intentions, or they may fear what people will think of them, So I think today that there's a number of folks who are Republican, and because they're Republican, maybe they voted for Trump, and now maybe they do or do not like Trump, but they voted their party line. This is a common thing that the parties do. You vote your party line, and sometimes that happens even when you're not 100% thrilled about your candidate, but you vote your party line. And now I think today there's a lot of people who voted that way, and because the opposite party is very robust and maybe more vocal. There's a lot of people who won't express their opinions. You know, they feel a certain way on a certain topic, and they might not say anything for fear of retaliation or judgment or people name calling. And now that's just to use one example. But we see this happening on a lot of big issues too. So not just political party lines, but, you know, other bigger world issues. So the problem comes into play when, you know, we're really just not open to other people's viewpoints, whether or not we agree with them or support them. We should at least be maintaining platforms where we can expose ourselves to that. Okay, so if we take a look at the next slide here, you know, we looked at just the pressures that are involved in groupthink and people wanting to uphold those group ideals and those group norms. Now, we looked at a video earlier in the semester when we were covering social influence. It was all about conformity. So it was like that, we looked at the first half of the video, and then the second half was about groupthink, and I told you all we would come back to this. So I posted this video to our week 15 Play-Doh tab. And so what you want to do is go there, click on the video, and watch the second half that has to do with groupthink. And you're going to hear, again, you can watch the whole thing and you'll see how conformity and the need for it and the drive for it kind of feeds right into what happens in groupthink, okay? And so the two concepts are really strongly linked. And so definitely go in and watch it. It's like 3 minutes. Watch that and you get a gist of how those two work together to influence people's attitudes, beliefs, and opinions. The best example, one of, that I can think of with groupthink happening was with the Challenger in 1985. Now, this was before all of you were born. But what happened is, you know, you had these astronauts getting ready to take off. And of course, with any rocket launch, there's so much work that goes into it before the actual launch. I mean, years and years of preparation. And this was a special group of astronauts. There was a couple civilians that trained to be astronauts, one of which was Christina McCullough, and she was a teacher. I think a fifth grade teacher. And she was trained to go up, and this was a special launch, and they were going to, you know, go up into space and collect some data and do some cool things. There was a lot of pressure for this launch to happen. It was a big deal. The economy kind of needed it. The morale of our country at the time really wanted it. But there were some reservations from the engineers, some warnings about the rocket being ready to launch. There was some engineers that voiced some opinions that it wasn't ready to launch and that, you know, it might not be safe to do so. Those warnings were all neglected. They weren't listened to. And there was this big group pressure that, no, we need to launch. This needs to happen. We've been waiting for this, da-da-da-da-da. And they did. They launched, and the rocket ship no sooner got out into the upper crust of the atmosphere, it blew up, and everybody on board died. And it was tragic. It was so tragic. And after it happened, everyone that was involved in the launch started going back through old meetings and transcripts of meetings and realized that, wow, there was a lot of warnings against launching, and we didn't listen, and we didn't pay attention to those warnings, and it was catastrophic for it. So this was a huge instance of groupthink. So some solutions would be to remain open to criticism, work with a diverse set of people that don't always think like you, include members outside of the group, so bring in outside people who can help give a new viewpoint, a fresh viewpoint, that aren't committed to the group, that aren't a part of the group and wouldn't feel the same pressures of those in the group. And then also train your group on how to make good decisions, how to be open to these things to avoid groupthink. Sometimes there's things that stand in the way, directly in the way of cooperation. One of those concepts that has been looked at in the research is this idea of the prisoner's dilemma. What it is, it's just an example of a social dilemma. So, what is a social dilemma? Well, it's really any situation in which each person can increase his or her individual gain by acting in a purely selfish way. um, but if all or most people in the group do the same thing, the outcomes experienced by everyone are reduced. So in the prisoner's dilemma, it's this sort of like mock situation where people are caught in a poor situation. They're caught by police, and let's just pretend that they are questioned in separate rooms. You know, maybe a crime is committed, and you're in on it with three people, and each person's being questioned in a certain room. Let's say there's two people, because that's the scenario I have here: prisoner A and prisoner B. If both the people cooperate, they can experience large gains. But if they choose to compete, or one person dissents, then each of them loses substantially, right? So if they both confess, they equally get 5 years. And it may be a lesser sentence because they both confessed and they cooperated, and they're going to serve some time, but it's going to be less than if they don't confess, potentially. If one confesses and the other remains silent, well, the one gets all the perks. Great, you get to go free, but you just did your friend in here who's now going to do 20 years. Okay. Let's take the other scenario of, so here's a similar, these two are the same. Let's take the scenario of you both cooperate again, but this time instead of both confessing, you both really remain silent, and you're both able to do that. You just don't hold any punches, you hold it all in. You both remain silent, and you're going to get some time because a crime was committed, but because not enough evidence is given and you don't rat each other out, you each end up with a year. So it's just an example of this scenario in which, in order to work effectively as a group, we have to cooperate. When we don't cooperate, it not only can it destroy the group, but it destroys the trust of the members in the group. And really what it does is create a negative interdependence. And in our society, we're not interdependent at all. We don't want to be. We want to be independent. We don't want to have to rely on anyone for anything. That's the American way. We are an individualistic society. When you have more collectivistic societies, you see more interdependence, and it works to the benefit of those in the group. Okay. All right. So that leads us into conflict, because when we don't have cooperation, we have conflict. And so conflict is really just a perceived incompatibility of actions, goals, or ideas. Remember, we talked about realistic conflict theory back in chapter 6 when we mentioned prejudice. And it really is just when groups work together, they have those superordinate goals, they can accomplish so much more. Remember the campers at Robbers Cave, the group of boys at the camps? They were able to come together and overcome their prejudices against one another. That conflict was there, it was real, because they were competing for resources that they each wanted, but what helped them get over it was those superordinate goals. So goals that both sides seek, and hence working together they can achieve. Okay, we see this happening, the same kind of conflict in the real world. If we just look at the whole diamond fields issue, with Sierra Leone being one of the most mined areas for diamonds. And these people are fighting over these scarce mineral resources, which has led to all kinds of factions and warring and fighting in Sierra Leone for control over those diamond fields. And instead of everyone working together and realizing that, wow, we have this huge resource that can benefit everyone here, you have selfish gains involved, and you have a few holding power that want it all for themselves. And so nothing gets accomplished for the greater good of humanity. And while there's evil in the world, we know we're never going to be able to get past this, issue of being able to cooperate. Okay, so there's just a few more slides that lead to causes of conflict that you should go over.